Gary Kurtz was born on July 27, 1940, in Los Angeles, California. In 1965, he was an assistant director on a western starring Jack Nicholson called Ride in the Whirlwind. He was a production manager on Voyage to the Prehistoric Planet. He then was an assistant director, second unit director, and camera operator on the musical comedy Beach Ball. In 1966, he was the production manager on Queen of Blood and a sound technician on Bloodbath. He was then an assistant camera operator on another western called The Shooting, and he worked as a production manager, assistant director, and editor on The Hostage. Gary Kurtz has worn many hats in his career, well-rounded and creative. From 1966 to 1969, Kurtz's film career was put on hold. He served in the United States Marine Corps as a combat cameraman in Vietnam. American Graffiti, the 1973 film, was the first time Gary Kurtz and George Lucas would collaborate. Kurtz was the producer. The duo would continue to collaborate on to Star Wars. Kurtz was once again the producer. After the success of Star Wars, Kurtz went on to produce The Empire Strikes Back. The film was budgeted for 100 days of shooting, but the shooting ended up taking 175 days, causing George Lucas to borrow $10 million to finish the film. Kurtz ended up having to direct parts of the film to keep up with the revised budget and schedule. There are two camps of Star Wars fans when it comes to Gary Kurtz. Actually, three camps of Star Wars fans. The first camp loves him. They see him as the guy who clashed with Lucas on how to progress the story of Star Wars. They see him as the guy who had a lot of good ideas for A New Hope and The Empire Strikes Back, and then got frustrated and parted ways with George Lucas before Return of the Jedi. He doesn't like the special editions. He doesn't like the prequels. The second camp of Star Wars fans sees Gary Kurtz as a whiner, a complainer, someone who just got frustrated and left or was told to leave. Not really clear. Someone who didn't get their way and just had creative differences. Most people in this camp do credit Kurtz for bringing a lot of good ideas to Star Wars, but overall they seem to see him as someone who complains about Ewoks and toys 30 years later. And the third camp of Star Wars fans don't know who he is and what role he played in the Star Wars franchise, which is fine. Some people don't go this deep. So, what did Gary Kurtz do for Star Wars? Well, he produced A New Hope, and he produced The Empire Strikes Back. He was a collaborator with Lucas. He often challenged Lucas's ideas and brought new ideas to the table. He was a big partner, a huge partner, in making Hope and Empire. He could say no. He wasn't a yes man. But after A New Hope and The Empire Strikes Back, Kurtz and Lucas had a falling out. Mark Hamill equated this separation to a mother and father getting divorced. Kurtz and Lucas had built the Star Wars universe together. Of course, George Lucas deserves more of the credit, of course. But Kurtz accounts often contradict the historic narrative put out by George Lucas of the Star Wars franchise. There will be a lot of quotes in this video. A lot of quotes that I find fascinating. Quote, "I could see where things were headed. The toy business began to drive the Lucasfilm empire. It's a shame. They make 3 times as much on toys as they do on films. It's natural to make decisions to protect the toy business, but that's not the best thing for making quality films. The emphasis on the toys, it's like the cart driving the horse. If it wasn't for that, the films would be done for their own merits. The creative team wouldn't be looking over their shoulder all the time." Close quote. Is that a fair statement? It seems kind of goofy to think that toys influence the direction of Star Wars. But this is coming from one of the main creative minds behind the first 2 films. You can't just dismiss it. If the guy who was side by side with Lucas since American Graffiti says something like this, you kind of have to accept some validity to it. Now, a lot of this has to do with your own personal opinion on Return of the Jedi and the prequels, of course. If you like all of them equally, you're probably more inclined to roll your eyes at statements like this. I get it. According to Gary Kurtz, there was no plan for multiple films. He basically says that this idea is a big myth that continues to get tossed around as fact. Originally, they wanted to do an actual Flash Gordon movie, but they couldn't get the rights. So they ended up making a movie similar to Flash Gordon. And the mythology of Star Wars was built around mythology found in Flash Gordon, Seven Samurai, Arthurian legend, and other sources. According to Kurtz, they planned on doing one Star Wars movie, and then moving on to work on Apocalypse Now with Francis Ford Coppola, and then a dark comedy similar to MASH. But, of course, Star Wars ended up being a huge success, and they ended up continuing their space opera. Quote, "One of the reasons Jedi came out the way it did was because the story outline of how Jedi was going to be seemed to get tossed out. And one of the reasons I was really unhappy was the fact that all of the carefully constructed story structure of characters and things that we did in Empire was going to carry over into Jedi. The resolution of that film was going to be quite bittersweet, with Han Solo being killed and the princess having to take over as queen of what remained of her people, leaving everybody else. In effect, Luke was left on his own. None of that happened, of course. It would have been quite sad and poignant and upbeat at the same time, because they would have won a battle. But the idea of another attack on another Death Star wasn't there at all. It, Jedi, was a rehash of Star Wars, with better visual effects, and there were no Ewoks. It was just entirely different. It was much more adult and straightforward." Close quote. No matter how positive or negative your outlook of Return of the Jedi is, this is interesting. The change of direction is what made Kurtz want to part ways with the franchise. I personally love Return of the Jedi, but I find the idea of a completely different story that was scrapped very intriguing. And me, as an adult now, I kind of wish I could have seen that film. When it comes to the special editions, I see eye to eye with Gary Kurtz. Quote, "When the idea of the special editions came up, and George talked about various things that we needed to do, I was worried that digital enhancement would stand out too much. In Star Wars, especially, I feel like most of the digital enhancements that were done, that added things that weren't just cleaning up matte lines and taking dirt out, are intrusive, and it would have been better without them. I don't like most of the enhancements, and think that they're a mistake, really. Again, I understand the whole idea behind the marketing and distribution. Fox wanted to say new and different, and you can't say new and different if there isn't something new and different. So you're kind of stuck in a way. Just fixing matte lines and cleaning up dirt isn't enough to reissue a film 20 years after the fact. I understand the reasoning behind it, but I don't like the result. I think that it's a minor annoyance. It doesn't ruin the film, it's just a minor annoyance in some of the scenes." Close quote. I agree. Of course I agree. This channel was born out of my love for the original cut and my disappointment with the special editions. Quote, "I don't like the tinkering process. I think it's a mistake. It's okay if films don't have everything that you wanted to put into them. I think the annoying thing about some of the Star Wars stuff is that some of the things that are in there are too much. I think if, at the time, we had the capacity and technology to be able to do some of those things, it would have been more than was in the original, but a lot less than was in the special edition. That's a greater judgment based on the moment. But the scene I object to the most is probably the Jabba the Hutt scene. We had technical difficulty shooting that scene originally, and that character was going to be a human being. We shot it 3 different times, and we had camera problems and damage to the negative, so we abandoned it. But in that process, we put all the information in that scene into the Greedo scene in the cantina. So if you listen carefully, you'll hear the dialogue is essentially the same. The story material that you get in that scene is what you get in the Greedo scene. So from a dramatic point of view, the scene is totally unnecessary, and the finished film is better without it, I think. Also, because Jabba is this giant slug rather than a human being, the sight lines are a bit odd, the position of the characters. If that had been the way the original scene was going to be shot, it would have been shot differently. So there are lots of problems with that scene. I just don't like it. I wince every time I've seen it. It's just a good example of a film not needing it, because we made an adjustment to allow for not using it by putting the material somewhere else." Close quote. It's not very often that we hear someone so close to the production of any Star Wars project talking about it in this way. But I don't see them as negative comments at all. They're realistic. They kind of contradict the mainstream narrative. The internet is full of random opinions that aren't really fleshed out. But here we have the producer of A New Hope and the producer of The Empire Strikes Back. Someone who said no, someone who helped build the Star Wars universe, someone responsible for a lot of creative decisions openly discussing a side of Star Wars that isn't often discussed by those associated with the franchise. In researching this video, I found a lot of forum posts claiming that all Kurtz does nowadays is bash Star Wars. I do not see it that way. He's answering questions posed to him in interviews. People are curious about this stuff. If an interviewer is curious about these topics, well, isn't it important for Kurtz to give an honest answer? He gives a lot of interviews and talks about a lot of topics that have nothing to do with Star Wars. Of course, Star Wars comes up a lot, but there are a lot of interviews. But the answers and questions that resonate with Star Wars fans are obviously the ones about Star Wars. So does he just bash Star Wars? No, that's goofy. He's just responding with his own unfiltered and honest opinions. Opinions that are far more valid than the opinions of most, because he was there. He saw the creation, he helped the creation, and left, or was forced to leave, because of creative differences. I like Gary Kurtz. We see eye to eye on a lot. I understand why the people that don't see eye to eye with him don't like him. Their feelings are just as valid as my own. Personal opinion sways the way people see other people. But that doesn't mean you shouldn't listen. That doesn't invalidate his claims, his outlook, and his experience. No matter what camp you fall into, it's undeniable that Kurtz had a big hand in bringing the Star Wars universe to life. And for that, he deserves everyone's appreciation. HelloGreedo, out.